My life wasn't built on dreams of glamour or wealth. It was built on sawdust and sweat, on the scent of pine and linseed oil. For 15 years, my world was a 5,000-square-foot workshop on the edge of town, a place my husband, Daniel, and I had poured every last cent and every waking moment into. He called it our business, but I knew the truth. It was my soul made tangible. I was the artist, the hands, the heart of it all. My grandfather had been a master carpenter, and he taught me to read wood like a language. I could see the story in every grain, every knot, every imperfection. I didn't just make furniture. I coaxed stories out of oak and ash and cherry. Each piece was a part of me. My day started before dawn, with the hum of the sander and the rhythmic scrape of a hand plane. My hands, calloused and often stained, were my pride. They were the hands that built our life. Daniel handled the important things. The books, the clients, the networking. He had the smooth smile and the firm handshake. He wore the suits while I wore the leather apron. I thought we were a team. I thought his ambition was for us. I loved him with a quiet, steady devotion that felt as solid and dependable as the old-growth maple I cherished. I made excuses for his long nights out, for the increasing secrecy around our finances. I told myself it was the stress of running a business. I told myself he was protecting me from the worries. I chose to believe in the man I married, the man who once told me my hands were the most beautiful things he had ever seen. The sacrifice was immense. We skipped vacations, drove a decade-old truck, and lived in a small apartment above the shop. Every dollar went back into the business. My friends drifted away, tired of my constant refrain of, I can't, I have to work. My life had narrowed to the four walls of that workshop, to the scent of wood and the presence of Daniel. And for a long time it was enough. It was everything. The day it all ended started with the smell of smoke. Not the comforting, sweet smell of a wood stove, but the acrid, chemical stench of something terribly wrong. It was just after 2 a.m. I was jolted awake not by an alarm, but by a primal sense of danger. The air was thick and hot. I stumbled out of bed, my throat instantly raw. The floor beneath my feet was warm. Daniel wasn't in bed. I screamed his name, my voice swallowed by a sudden, violent roar from below. The workshop, our life, it was on fire. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I ran for the door, but a wall of black smoke pushed me back. I couldn't breathe. My eyes streamed. I remember crawling towards the living room window, the one that led to the fire escape. The heat was blistering, the sounds were terrifying, the groan of timbers, the explosion of glass. I was sobbing, calling his name, convinced he was trapped downstairs. I threw open the window, the rush of cooler air a brief, blessed relief. I scrambled onto the fire escape, my nightgown snagging on the rusted metal. And then I saw him, Daniel. He was standing across the street, next to our truck, bathed in the hellish orange glow of the fire. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't calling for help. He was just watching my soul burn to the ground. Our eyes met across the chaos. In that moment, I saw everything. The missing money, the hushed phone calls, the look of a cornered animal I had seen in his eyes for months. It wasn't a tragic accident. It was a demolition. He had done this. He had lit the match. I must have screamed, a raw, wounded sound, but I couldn't hear it over the sirens that were now wailing in the distance. Firefighters were swarming the scene. Neighbors were pouring out of their homes, their faces a mixture of horror and pity. And I was just standing there on the fire escape, a lone figure in a white nightgown, pointing a trembling finger at my husband. He just looked back, his face a mask of cold resolve. When a firefighter finally helped me down the ladder, my legs gave out. I collapsed on the asphalt, shaking uncontrollably. Daniel walked over, the perfect picture of a concerned husband. He tried to put his coat around me, but I flinched away, like he was the fire itself. It's all gone, baby, he whispered, his voice laced with a sickening, false sympathy. Everything. We've lost everything. I looked up at him, my face smeared with soot and tears. No, I rasped, my voice broken. You lost everything. The crowd parted. A police officer was there. People were looking at us, at him, at me. The humiliation was a physical blow, as real as the heat from the flames. In their eyes, I was just a hysterical, grieving wife. But I knew. He had set fire to my life, and he was going to stand there and pretend to mourn its loss with me. That was the real betrayal. Not the fire, but the coldness in his eyes as he watched it burn.
Naquele momento, meu chão desapareceu. Foi a dor mais profunda que já senti. Se você já passou por uma grande decepção e entende o que é ter o coração partido, por favor, curta este vídeo para eu saber que não estou sozinha nesta jornada.
The weeks that followed are a blur of gray. The fire took everything. The workshop, our home, every tool, every sketch, every finished piece waiting for delivery. All of it reduced to a mountain of charred timber and bitter ash. The insurance investigation was a slow, agonizing process. Daniel was questioned, of course. He had an alibi, a late meeting with a client I'd never heard of. There was no concrete proof, just the smoldering certainty in my heart. He played the part of the devastated husband perfectly. He'd hold my hand in front of the adjusters, his eyes full of fake tears, and I'd feel my skin crawl. We were staying in a sterile, beige motel room that smelled of stale cigarettes and despair. I spent most of my days in bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, while Daniel was out handling things. He'd come back late, smelling of expensive cologne, not smoke. The money from the initial insurance payout, a small sum for living expenses, disappeared as quickly as it arrived. I had nothing. The woman who had built a renowned business with her own two hands couldn't even afford to buy a decent meal. I was a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that no longer existed. My friends tried to reach out, but I couldn't speak. What could I say? My husband burned down my life, and I can't prove it. It sounded insane. So I let the calls go to voicemail until they stopped coming. Loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. One afternoon, Daniel came into the room and tossed a set of papers on the bed. Divorce filings. He said it was for the best, that the trauma had broken us. He said he needed a fresh start. He didn't say that the fresh start was a 24-year-old receptionist he'd been seeing for 6 months. I found that out later. He left me in that motel room with $100 and the clothes on my back. That was my severance package for 15 years of devotion. That was the bottom. I truly believed my life was over. The fire had taken the past, and Daniel had taken the future. There was nothing left but an empty, aching present. A few days later, a box arrived at the motel's front desk. It had been salvaged from the wreckage, the only thing to survive in my old fireproof safe. It was my grandfather's tool chest. Not his primary set, but the small, beautiful boxwood case containing his most delicate carving tools and his journals. I took it back to my room and pried it open. The smell of old wood and oil was a balm to my raw nerves. I ran my fingers over the familiar rosewood handles of the chisels. And underneath them, I found the journals. Thin, leather-bound books filled with his elegant, looping script. I sat on the floor and began to read. He wrote about his techniques, his philosophies on wood, his life. And then I found it. An entry from 1958. He wrote about a terrible storm that had knocked a massive, ancient oak tree onto his workshop, crushing half of it. He thought he was ruined. He wrote of his despair, of feeling like his hands were useless, his spirit broken. But then he described going out to the wreckage and finding a man he barely knew, a quiet neighbor named Arthur, already there, methodically clearing the debris. Arthur, he wrote, had seen the value in the fallen oak, in the story of its survival, and encouraged him not to see it as an end, but as a source of new, stronger material. This small act of quiet kindness from a near stranger, he wrote, was the spark that allowed him to rebuild. It wasn't about the wood. It was about being seen, about one person showing up in the darkness. As I sat there, crying, a thought lodged itself in my brain. I remembered the chaos of the fire, the scramble down the fire escape. I always assumed I had gotten out on my own, running on pure adrenaline. But the memories were hazy, confused.
Why?
A week later, I took a bus to the fire station. I needed to thank them. I walked in, feeling small and out of place. I asked for the captain who had been in charge that night. A kind-faced man with tired eyes named Captain Evans met me in a small office. I thanked him and his crew, my voice trembling. I told him I barely remembered escaping, that it was all a blur. He looked at me, a strange, hesitant expression on his face. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you didn't escape on your own. You were already on the lawn when my team arrived. Someone carried you out before we even got the first hose running." I stared at him, confused. "But who?" My husband was across the street. Captain Evans opened a drawer and pulled out a tablet. A bystander sent us their phone footage. "It's grainy, but you should see this." He played the clip. It was chaotic, shaky. I saw the flames, the smoke. And then I saw it. A figure emerging from the smoke-filled doorway of the workshop, a body held carefully in his arms. My body. The figure stumbled onto the grass and gently laid me down before disappearing back into the chaos, just as the first fire truck pulled up. It wasn't Daniel. It wasn't a firefighter. It was a man I recognized but couldn't immediately place. He was older, broad-shouldered. The captain zoomed in on the man's face for a split second, and my breath caught in my chest. It was Mr. Henderson, the quiet, gentle, 60-something widower who owned the lumberyard. The man who would always save the most beautiful, figured pieces of wood for me, telling me, "This one has a story only you can tell." He was a man of few words, but he had seen me. He had seen my worth. And in the most terrifying moment of my life, while my husband watched me burn, this near stranger had walked into the fire and carried me out. That was the spark. The tiny, fragile, impossible spark of hope in the suffocating darkness. That image on the captain's tablet replayed in my mind for days. Mr. Henderson, walking into the fire. For me, it was a debt I could never repay, a kindness so profound it fundamentally shifted something inside me. The self-pity that had been my constant companion began to feel indulgent. My life wasn't over. It had been saved. I owed it to the man who saved it to live. I checked out of the motel, using the last of my money to rent a tiny room in a boarding house. And I went to see him. I found him at the lumberyard, his hands as gnarled as an old oak burl, carefully stacking planks of cedar. He saw me and his face, usually so placid, registered a flicker of shock. I didn't know what to say. "Thank you" felt laughably inadequate. So I just stood there and cried. He didn't rush me. He just waited, his presence as solid and calming as the giant trees around us. Finally, I managed to whisper, "You saved my life." "Why?" He looked down at his hands, then back at me. His voice was rough, like bark. "I saw the smoke from my house. I knew you were in there. I couldn't let all those stories turn to ash." He wasn't just talking about the wood. He was talking about me. From that day on, something new began. I had my grandfather's tools and his journals. I had the fire of my own story. I went back to Mr. Henderson and made a proposition. I had no money, no workshop, but I had my hands and a new kind of determination. I asked him if I could use a small, forgotten corner of his lumberyard, a dusty old shed, to work. In exchange, I would repair his equipment, build him new shelving, whatever he needed. He agreed without a moment's hesitation. He did more than that. He started leaving me pieces of wood. Not just any wood. Difficult pieces. Wood that other carpenters would reject. A piece of maple with a deep scorch mark from a forest fire. An old beam from a demolished church, riddled with nail holes. A slab of walnut with a twisting, unpredictable grain. He was challenging me. He was reminding me that scars could be beautiful. The work was brutal. I was starting from less than zero. I worked from dawn until my muscles screamed. Then I'd read my grandfather's journals by the light of a single bulb. I learned his forgotten techniques for joinery, for finishing, for coaxing character out of flawed materials. There were days I wanted to give up. My hands would bleed. A piece I'd worked on for a week would split. The grief would wash over me in waves. But then I would think of Mr. Henderson walking into that fire and I would pick up my tools again. My first real project was for him. I took a piece of the scorched maple he'd given me. I didn't sand away the blackness. I made it the centerpiece. I worked the char into the design, a stark, beautiful reminder of survival. I polished the unburnt wood around it to a mirror shine. It became a small, exquisite table, a testament to resilience. I gave it to him, and for the first time, I saw tears in the old man's eyes. He put it in the front office of the lumberyard with a small, handwritten card that said, "Made by the best hands in the county." That table was my first victory. A customer saw it while buying lumber and asked who made it. Mr. Henderson gave him my name. That customer ordered a bookshelf. He told his friends. Slowly, painstakingly, word began to spread. They called my work Phoenix Furniture. Pieces born from fire, from salvage materials, from stories of survival. I wasn't just a carpenter anymore. I was a storyteller, and my medium was the scars in the wood. A woman came to me, a recent widow. She brought me a piece of a cherry tree from her yard that had been struck by lightning the day her husband died. She wanted a memory box. I spent a month on it, inlaying the jagged crack from the lightning strike with a thin vein of silver. When I gave it to her, we both wept. I was helping people heal by honoring their scars. I was healing myself. The shed became a proper workshop. I bought new tools. I hired a young apprentice. I wasn't getting rich, but I was building something real, something that was entirely mine. My name began to carry weight. A local design magazine did a small feature on me. I was no longer the victim of a fire. I was the artist who created beauty from the ashes. It was there, with sawdust in my hair and my grandfather's chisel in my hand, that I began to reescrever a minha historia.
Deixei de ser a vítima e me tornei a autora do meu destino. Se a minha jornada de superação está te inspirando, inscreva-se no canal para acompanhar os próximos capítulos e fazer parte desta comunidade de recomeços.
2 years after the fire, my new life had a rhythm. It was a quiet rhythm, dictated by the seasons of wood and the needs of my clients. The workshop was my sanctuary, a place of peace and creation. Mr. Henderson, who I now called Arthur, was my dearest friend. Our bond was unspoken, forged in smoke and sealed in sawdust. We'd often share a simple lunch together among the stacks of lumber, talking about wood, about life, about everything and nothing. The success was modest, but it was deep and meaningful. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, the past walked in. It was Daniel. I hadn't seen him since he'd left me in that motel room. He looked different. The expensive suit was still there, but it hung on him a little loosely. There were lines of desperation around his eyes that his charming smile couldn't quite hide. He walked into my workshop, looking around with a calculated awe. "Wow," he said, his voice dripping with the old, familiar insincerity. "You've really done something here. I always knew you had it in you." I didn't stop my work. I continued sanding the edge of a tabletop, the steady motion of my hands a comfort. "What do you want, Daniel?" I asked, my voice even calm. It wasn't the broken, weeping voice he remembered. This voice was new. It had the strength of old-growth wood. He took a step closer. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I was drowning in debt. I was panicked. What I did, it was unforgivable, I know. But I miss you. I miss us." I finally stopped and looked at him. I looked at this man who had been the center of my universe, and I felt nothing. Just a profound, quiet emptiness where my love for him used to be. "There is no us," I said simply. "You burned it to the ground. You remember that, don't you?" He tried another angle, the victim. "I paid for it, you know. That woman, she took everything. The insurance money is long gone."
I'm struggling. I saw the article about you.
I was so proud. I thought, maybe she can find it in her heart to forgive me. Maybe we can start again. I can help you with the business side just like before. And that's when I finally understood. He wasn't here because he loved me. He was here because I was successful. I was another asset he could leverage. The confrontation I had once dreaded now felt like a simple clarification. There was no anger, no need for revenge. There was only the truth. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked over to him, stopping a few feet away. "Let me tell you a story, Daniel," I said, my voice soft but unyielding. "On the night you set fire to my life, I thought I escaped alone. I thought I crawled out of that inferno by myself. For months, I believed I was a survivor who had saved herself. I watched his face, saw the flicker of confusion. But I was wrong. I was unconscious from the smoke. Someone else saved me. While you were standing across the street, watching your investment go up in flames, another man walked into that burning building, found me on the floor, and carried me out in his arms. A man who owed me nothing. A man who barely knew me but saw my value, even when I was covered in soot and near death." The color drained from Daniel's face. He knew exactly who I was talking about. Arthur was just outside, loading a truck. You see, I continued. The difference between you and him is the difference between everything. You see things to use. He sees things to save. You see a balance sheet. He sees a story worth telling. So no, Daniel. We cannot start again. You can't help me with this business. You could never understand what it's built on. It's not built on profit margins. It's built on gratitude. It's built on the kindness of a good man who walked through fire. I pointed to the door. You should go now. He stood there for a moment, stripped of all his charm and bravado. He was just a small, empty man. He turned and left without another word. As the door closed behind him, I felt the last wisp of smoke from my old life finally clear. My legacy isn't in the furniture I build. It's in the act of rebuilding. It's in knowing that our deepest wounds can become our greatest source of strength. My peace is here, in the scent of cedar and the feel of a perfectly smooth finish. It's in the quiet companionship of a man who showed me what true strength and love look like. It's in the knowledge that I didn't just survive the fire. I was reborn in it.